Hi, everybody, and welcome back to A Foggy Day on Olympus, where we've been exploring history, religion, and culture from the perspectives of the Greek gods on Mount Olympus, viewing the world with dispassionate judgment, which is what we are also attempting to do. My name is Coel Campo.
And I'm Mike Pierce, and this is the second in our series on Poland and Ukraine. We're calling the series Eastern Catastrophes, Poland and Ukraine in Modern Times. Last week our emphasis was mostly on Ukraine, giving a longer term look at what had happened and the differences within what we now consider to be Ukraine today. Today we're shifting our focus much more to Poland, but both episodes take in the other because their histories are wrapped up, and that will become even more obvious over the next couple of weeks. Well, last time we finished by mentioning the fact that in the late 18th century, Poland, or the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which had been a huge state in the late Middle Ages and early modern times, simply disappeared. It was swallowed up by its three greedy neighbours in three stages. In 1772, in 1793, and then just 2 years later, 1795, Poland was extinguished completely. Prussia got about 19% of what had been Poland, including Posen or Poznan. Austria, the Habsburg Empire, got about 18%, including Western Ukraine, Galicia and Volhynia. Russia got by far the largest share, around 63%, including central Ukraine, Belarus, White Russia, and Polish Livonia, or Lithuania. But as a result of the Napoleonic Wars, which come along just shortly after that, Russia ended up with even more of historic Poland, around 82%, including Warsaw and central Poland, with Austria's share reduced to 11% and Prussia's to 7%.
What did the Napoleonic Wars have to do with this? Why did they become reshuffled after the Napoleonic Wars?
Well, Napoleon had conquered most of Europe during this period and ended up destroying a whole lot of states. And the Congress of Vienna in 1814 to 15 was designed to redraw the map of Europe, but it did not bring back all of the states that had existed before. Some of them were gone forever, but amongst the many things that were agreed between the big powers, the big victor powers in the war, particularly the Russians, the British and the Austrians, this included the settlement in what had been Poland. And Russia ended up with a whole load more of it.
Going back to our map here, so this little island of white up against the Baltic coast, is that East Prussia?
Right. That's East Prussia, yeah. Prussia was the state that was increasingly coming to dominate all the other little German states at the expense of Austria, and that process would continue through the 19th century and culminate in 1870, 1871, when Germany would be reunited but under Prussian domination and under the Prussian king, who then became the German Kaiser or Emperor, from the Prussian capital of Berlin. But that's all for the future. Although by the end of the Napoleonic Wars, this can be seen, this is a tendency that's clearly coming. Prussia is one of the major powers of the peace settlement.
So back to Poland.
To get back to Poland, right. Yeah, well, in our next map, we can see Congress Poland, the Poland that's under Russian rule, and it's a notionally autonomous state, actually referred to as the Kingdom of Poland, but the king is simply the Russian Tsar. It's actually simply a chunk of the Russian Empire, with its own institutions being progressively eroded, as we'll see in a moment. Well, how did Poles fare under foreign rule? A couple of caveats we need to mention. The population of all these lands was very mixed. It's not just Poles. There's people whom we would now consider to be Belarusians or Ukrainians, people who spoke, at any rate, East Slavic languages rather than Polish, which is West Slavic, and Lithuanians, completely different language group, as well as Germans and Jews speaking Yiddish in the town. So there's a right old mixture there. And we should also say, and this is going to upset some nationalistically minded people, that only a minority, a growing minority, of middle-class urbanites and some of the nobility resented foreign rule on national grounds. National consciousness was a rising modern force. Most historians date its beginnings to the French Revolution, actually. You can take it back a little further than that, but it certainly doesn't go all the way back. So those people, particularly the numerous, not always very rich nobility, the Szlachta, felt that they had really lost something. They were no longer running Poland. They did feel like they were under foreign rule. But that's not going to be necessarily true of ordinary people, particularly in the countryside. But to make the distinctions, Austrian rule was the most benign. And in the later 19th century, the Habsburgs actually favoured Polish institutions and culture, often at the expense of Ukrainian ones, in the area of western Ukraine and around Lviv, that was under their control. Prussia, and after 1871, we'd have to say a German rule, was a little bit harsher. It wasn't necessarily very hostile, but it sought to assimilate ethnic Poles. And Russian rule was the most repressive and the most resented, which is unfortunate because Russia encompassed by far the largest part of what had been Poland.
These are the hungry neighbors that you mentioned earlier and in the last episode that Poland is divided between.
Right.
And now we're going to look at what Poland looked like under each of these rulers.
Well, we're going to skip on the German ones, but we're certainly going to look at what it was like under Russian rule and under Austrian rule. So in Russian Poland, there were two really major uprisings against Russian rule in Poland, supported by many townspeople, middle class, upper middle class, and minor nobility. Firstly, what we call the November uprising of November 1830 through to October 1831, and another one, what we call the January uprising, from 1863 to 64. We're not going to look at these in any detail. Both were crushed. Russia could always raise more forces. Nationalism, as we've said, held a strong sway among the nobility and in the towns, but not really among the peasant majority. There was, in any case, a so-called Holy Alliance, which is a rather strange name, given that the three parties to it, Russia, Austria and Prussia, adhered to different religious confessions. The Tsar was Eastern Orthodox, the Habsburgs were Catholic, and Prussia was Protestant. But the alliance was designed to contain nationalism, which of course was a rising force, and it meant that Austria and Prussia gave no help to the insurgents in Poland. And also the papacy, which was very anxious to contain nationalism and the advent of popular rule as well, condemned the uprisings. Never mind the fact that the rebels were his flock, Catholics, and they were rebelling against an Orthodox power. So all of these factors taken together made it very difficult and contributed in the end to the failure of these risings.
This holy alliance of religions, they're, trying to contain nationalism because the narrative of nationalism doesn't really fit at the time with the narrative of these churches. Is that right?
That's right. I mean, it didn't clash so strongly with Protestantism, but because Protestantism, going back to the Reformation, had the idea that the church was subject to the state and you could have a different church in each state and that was all fine, right? The trouble with nationalism from all of these points of view was that it wanted to define the state in terms of its population rather than in terms of who ruled it.
Right.
and particularly where you have a very obviously multi-ethnic and multi-confessional state. The logic of that is simply going to be to tear your kingdom apart, or your empire apart, as indeed happened in the end.
Right.
Yeah. Concerning Prussia, it's a slightly different story, but very, very briefly, we're not going to pursue this very far. What would happen in the 19th century is that the Prussian monarchy was very suspicious of German nationalism, as indeed later on was his principal minister, Bismarck, despised the nationalists, but did want a larger Prussia. And so very queasily made a deal with these obnoxious people that we will work together with you so that we will have slightly less absolute rule by monarchs, and you will help us to get a larger monarchy in the process, rather similar to what happened in Italy with Piedmont, Sardinia. Anyway, we can't pursue that one now, and I dare say I've thrown out a few things there that will outrage one or two people, but I'm afraid that is pretty much the way it was. Okay, so going swiftly back to Poland here. So the first of these uprisings in 1830 begins with the siege of the arsenal in Warsaw by Polish military cadets, and as we can see in our next picture, this is a picture of the Battle of Stoczek the following February. Despite these early successes, the Polish rebels couldn't compete, possibly, with the sheer size of resources that the Russian Empire could bring to bear.
And this sounds kind of sickeningly familiar with what's going on in Ukraine right now.
Right. You can have successes. The Russian armies then, as now, are not always well led. Right? And if you've got a determined local population ready to fight them, then you can have successes. But at the end of the day, they are many times bigger and can keep simply throwing forces into the conflict until you're ground down. And the Poles did not have the assistance of the outside world in the way that Ukraine does right now. So it ended in a rather unsurprising way. Well, we've got a few pictures here from late in the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, showing Warsaw, a Russian-held Warsaw. So these rebellions led the government in St. Petersburg to pursue ever greater Russification of Poland and destroying Polish independent institutions. So we've got another picture here of Warsaw in the 1880s, colourised photograph. As I know you know, and perhaps one or two others might, one of my obsessions is getting hold of digitally enhanced and well colourised photos from the 19th and early 20th centuries. So here's a chance to show off some, at least, of my vast collection. One here from Warsaw in the 1890s. This is a postcard, not particularly well done, I think, from Warsaw in the early 20th century. Okay, looking southwards then, what about Austrian Poland or Galicia?
And some people hearing Galicia are going to think this is a region in northwest Spain.
And they too will not be wrong. There are, I'm afraid, two Galicias. Well, local people won't have called it Galicia, but Halic. But Galicia is a kind of a Latinization, I suppose, of that. And it's the one that concerns us here. But yes, there is a very different Galicia at the other end of Europe. So on the maps here, we can see Galicia on the northeasternmost part, in brown there, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And to get some idea of where that stands in relation to current borders, the map on the right-hand side shows Western Galicia inside what is Poland now, and Eastern Galicia inside what is now Ukraine. So here we've got a picture of a couple of families from Austrian Galicia. The one on the left-hand side, Jewish, the other Hutsul. Hutsuls are now sadly greatly diminished, but very much treasured minority in Western Ukraine. They are really a sub-variety of Slavic Ukrainian. And next we've got a picture of the principal city in Galicia, shown here around 1900, with all of its different names.
Yeah, I know from going to the Balkans that many places have several different names, but what's going on with this one?
Right, well, it's Lviv if you're Ukrainian, Lvov if you're Polish, and Lemberg if you're a German speaker, and Lemberg if you're speaking Yiddish. And if that looks very similar to the German one, that's because Yiddish is mostly a variety of German. So all of these names, and one or two more, will have been used during this period. Now, we've got another picture here of the same city. In 1910, its population was about 206,000. Today, it's just over 700,000. And in 1910, 86% of the population spoke Polish, 11% spoke Ukrainian, 3% spoke German. But if we look at it from a religious point of view, just over half were Roman Catholic, and that will have included a lot of the Germans, it will have included pretty much all of the Poles. 19% were Uniate, which is Greek Catholic. It's a subset of Roman Catholicism. And 28% are Jewish. So of those Jews, they might be speaking Yiddish, but they will also, on this evidence, be speaking mostly Polish as well.
So, just to be clear, this city now, it's in Western Ukraine, but now, looking at it in 1910, only 11% of its people spoke Ukrainian and 86% spoke Polish. So what percentage are actually Poles today?
Well, only less than 1% are Poles today. This is all part of a vast catastrophe across East Central Europe during the middle of the 20th century, where huge numbers of people were murdered. One thinks particularly of the Holocaust, but not only that, or driven out, or sometimes forcibly assimilated. So to go through East Central Europe today to visit cities is to visit places with enormously discontinuous pasts, fairly recent pasts. A number of years ago, I went to Western Ukraine and went to Lviv, a beautiful city, at least in the central area, and Kolomia and Chernivtsi, and part of my self-appointed mission was to visit the local museums and try and assess how honest they were being about the past of the city they lived in, because the populations had been just totally transformed. Yeah. One of my many fantasies, an imaginary library that I will never finally write, would be to take a journey from the Baltic Sea down through this region, through the Carpathians and Transylvania, down to Istanbul, and compare who lived there in 1900 with who lives there now. And the transformation is utter in loads of these regions. What has happened is that modernist ideologies have homogenized whole vast swathes of territory and done gigantic cultural damage. And still, Lviv is a beautiful city, even today.
Yeah, I'm sure the locals love it when you come poking around, analyzing their ancestry and telling them how their historical narratives are wrong.
Well, I didn't quite do that, but I've noticed, and I mean, I've noticed even in this part of the world, in the Balkans, that your knowledge of local history as a foreigner is not necessarily admired or approved of, like your command of language might be. It's actually disapproved of, because you are less susceptible to be palmed off with the local fantasy, the local national fantasy, whatever that is. Okay, well, a couple of pretty useful books on Austrian Galicia are these two, which are appearing on the slide now, so you can look at them properly. The one, Oil Empire, is about the oil industry, the rise of the oil industry in late Habsburg Galicia. That's a little specialised, but interesting because the wider insights it gives to what's going on in the society as a whole. But the history of Lemberg, Lviv in the early 20th century is particularly fascinating. It takes you through, blow by blow, each of these cataclysmic transformations. As I mentioned to you when we were talking before doing this recording, I'm going to be showing a few books in this episode for two reasons. Everybody does everything they do for two reasons. A really good reason and the real reason. Okay, so the really good reason is the obvious one. If anybody watching this wants to know what's good to pursue this subject further and to read up on, I'd certainly recommend these books. And the real reason is because there are going to be people from various parts of the world, but perhaps particularly including this one, who will be totally taken over in their minds by either Polish or Lithuanian or Ukrainian or perhaps Belarusian nationalist views, and outraged that we don't reflect them to the uttermost, and will want to pick us up on this, that and the other thing. And this is simply telling them, shut up. Right. So...
in the nicest way possible.
In the nicest way possible, yes, exactly. Okay, well, we are moving swiftly on here. So, and of course, people whose whole worldview is informed by their local nationalism can quite justifiably complain that we've left out loads of facts that might deserve attention. We are taking here a grand sweep over something that is extremely complex. And one of the things we're going to be doing in the first part of next week's episode is revisiting some of the events we can consider here only on the Ukrainian side of the equation. But today we're really looking mostly at the Polish story. Well, Austrian Poland comes to an end, as so much comes to an end, with the advent of the First World War in 1914.
As a warning to some viewers and a relief to probably a lot more, we're not going to be covering the whole story of the Eastern Front in World War One.
No, we're not. Or this episode would be like 3 hours long or something like that. Yeah, because that in itself is another immensely complicated story, and one which, in my experience, most Westerners don't know anything about.
Right.
I mean, just take my own country, Brits, for example, that they really do think that, with the possible exception of Gallipoli, the Western Front was the First World War. Right. And maybe Americans are worse. They think the First World War didn't start till 1917. Anyway,
yeah.
Just kidding. But there's this tendency towards kind of like national myopia for everybody, right? Which is understandable. But we've simply got to drop it if we want to understand what happened and why different people acted the way that they do. Okay, so we've got a map here showing the grand sweep of the Eastern Front across World War. It starts in the very beginning in August 1914 with some significant Russian victories, but they are quickly reversed. And after that, the traction is nearly all with the Central Powers, that is Germany and Austria-Hungary, pushing the much more poorly equipped Russian Empire back. Russia was industrialising actually pretty fast in the years before World War One, but they were so far behind Germany that they didn't even have the railway lines to keep their troops equipped to the extent that the Central Powers did. Nevertheless, in late 1914, in Galicia, so the Austrian-controlled part of the front, the Russians were still advancing. The Austrian forces were nothing like as well organised or effective as their German partners. And this picture shows some Galician Jews, of whom there are very many, who are well aware of all the pogroms that had happened in the Russian Empire, and knowing that they are actually pretty well treated in the Austrian Empire. They are fleeing to make sure they stay in Habsburg-controlled territory, and quite rightly so. Okay. This next picture shows Russian troops entering Lemberg, or Lviv, Limerick, in September 1914, and they would be there until the following spring.
Yeah, and if I'm living in Lviv, I'm probably going to be unhappy about this, because Russia, treats its Poles and Jews worse than the Habsburg Empire does.
Right. So the majority of inhabitants of the town, we can safely say, are not very happy with this. The Ukrainian minority may have felt differently, that these are our Eastern Slav brothers, but not necessarily. And the Russians were driven out about, I forget the exact date when they were driven out now, but it was late spring 1915, I think. Well, our next picture shows a burning village of Żurowice in Austrian Poland in May 1915, caught up in the fighting. And the next splendid photograph has Austrian cavalry chasing retreating Russians. And now we have, this is a report in a Hungarian newspaper, German troops coming down the Jewish street of a town in Russian Poland. The Russian Jews stand in front of their miserable houses and are particularly glad when the Russians, of whom they had to suffer a lot, leave their towns. It's a veritable salvation for them when the Germans occupy the city. Now, okay, this is a Hungarian newspaper, so they're going to talk up their German allies, but nevertheless, that's not exactly wrong. The next picture shows German soldiers with Polish Jews, and of course, looking at this, we can't but be aware that a generation later, this relationship would be both similar, German forces advancing into Poland, where there are lots of Jews, and of course completely different.
Yeah, this is really kind of creepy in view of what we know is going to happen a generation later.
Right. This is one experience, and a generation later it's going to be the same but utterly different and horrifying. Yes.
And really, is anti-Semitism is really in place at this point already, or not so much?
Oh, yeah, very strong, certainly amongst Russians and Ukrainians and Poles. I mean, it's there everywhere. It's there amongst Germans, but it's nothing like as deep-seated amongst Germans as it is in the lands to their east.
Right.
I mean, that will all change because between the wars, Hitler makes a total fetish of it, makes it central to his whole programme. And so that does change everything. But that's not like the default position or a central, strong emotion in the German psyche at this point. Amongst some thinkers, yes, but the average German, no.
And if you want to learn more about what the anti-Semitism picture looked like, you can go back and watch some of our previous videos.
Yeah, particularly the one enabling the Holocaust, which you can see here. Okay. All right, our next picture shows a Russian fortification battalion leaving Warsaw shortly before Warsaw's capture by German troops in early August 1915. And here I want to wave another book at you, which we've got in the next slide. It's called A Minor Apocalypse, Warsaw during the First World War. The German occupation was relatively benign. The Germans didn't really mean the inhabitants of Warsaw any harm, but they were nevertheless ruthless in extracting desperately needed food and resources from their new territories. All the participants to the war had this problem. In the long run, the Central Powers would suffer it most. The British were enacting a blockade on German ports right the way through the war. By the end of the war, the Germans were really seriously hungry. So what they needed was resources in the east, and they took it. But that led to hunger and serious hardship amongst the population of Warsaw. The author of this book, you can see from his name, Blaubaum, Jewish, is also interested very much in Polish-Jewish relations amongst these different segments of the population in the city. Well, this next picture shows Russian troops retreating and burning villages in order to slow down the German troops.
Yeah, this is what we call scorched earth, right? The Russians had done the same thing 100 years before against Napoleon.
Yes, they had. Yes. And whilst Russia is hardly unique in doing this, it's unusual, particularly in modern times. And it is, I'm going to venture the opinion here that it kind of reflects the larger mentality that's there in the long run in Russia, that individual people don't matter. What matters is the state and society, and individual people exist to serve it. I know one could make a counter-argument about the morality of doing this. That doesn't seem very moral, though. But certainly I think that's part and parcel of what's going on. That it's more important that these resources be deprived to the enemy than that our citizens survive, yes.
Right. And everybody loses kind of a situation.
Yes, they do. Okay, we've now got another brilliant picture of Hungarian hussars in Poland, and then of a destroyed town in Rochatin in Galicia. Here's German troops in Mikulinci in Galicia in late July 1917. Now, by this later stage of the war, the Austrians were becoming very weak, as were the Russians, and the Germans were having to fortify their allies all over the place, including the Ottomans much further south, and the Austrians in northern Italy and so on. But they were having to help out here. And of course, during 1917, the Russian Empire disintegrates into revolution, collapses, or two revolutions, one in the spring and another one in October, November. First off is a collection of various liberals, democrats, socialists of various kinds, and they attempt to pursue the war, but with no greater effect than the Tsarist government, and in the end they're overthrown by Lenin and his Bolsheviks that fall. And so on the Eastern Front, Germany's triumphant and it advances far into Belarus and Ukraine, and chaos descended on what had been the Russian Empire, especially in the west of the empire, where Germans, revolutionaries of several kinds, not just the Bolsheviks, whites again of several kinds, and local nationalists vied for control.
And just as a as a side note here, for any Americans possibly who are listening, this is sort of the trouble with the revolution, is it really leaves you open to, well, invasion from other countries. So I thought that was interesting.
I mean, not in the case of America, of course, but of course, right. Well, America's a long way from anywhere, and certainly at the time of the revolution it was. Even the Mexicans were far, well, Spanish far away then. But yeah, it is absolute chaos. Perhaps the bigger picture, the thing that where America was even more fortunate, right? You could say, well, foreign invasion was never really on the cards for America because it's so far away from anywhere. But what could have been on the cards and wasn't, and America was extremely fortunate, was that revolutions tend to splinter into many different factions. Right? Once the legitimacy of the old existing government or power has been broken, well, who the heck are you to tell the rest of us what to do once you've seized control yourself? And also, revolutions tend to have centrifugal forces. And America pretty much got away with that. It didn't get away with the tendency of revolutions to become more radical as they go along. If you remember your American history, that started off as protests about various British government actions and wanting representation in Parliament, and you have to get a year into the war before the faction takes over that says, no, we want an independent United States.
Right.
So it did fall prey to that tendency, but not to the sort of extreme vociferousness. But that's what we're getting here, right? Absolute chaos breaking out. And of course, it's because that's such a common pattern that causes historically many people to support the existing power, even if they don't much like it, to come down on the side of conservatism, because the alternative they correctly see will be anarchy. And anarchy is exactly what happened. The Russian Civil War went on for several years and killed almost as many people as the entirety of World War I on all sides. It's that kind of big. It was an absolute catastrophe. Well, let's get back to our Poland-Ukrainian-ish story on this aspect of it. So, looking at the map here, on the 3rd of March 1918, so World War I is still going on, but the Bolshevik Revolution has, in theory, happened. It doesn't have proper control because it's fighting everybody. On 3rd of March 1918, the new Bolshevik regime conceded vast territories in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk as the price of peace with Germany. Germany knew that it had Russia on the ropes. And so it wanted huge territories, basically because it wanted all the food that's produced in Ukraine. It needed it desperately. And the new regime simply wanted to buy the Germans off at any price, because it needed its hands free to fight its domestic enemies as Russia descended further and further into civil war. Okay, so in that context we need to look at the re-establishment of Poland, which has not existed as a state for 130 years. So the peace treaties of Versailles in 1919 redrew the frontiers of Europe in the aftermath of World War One. The Russian Empire was no more, and Russia was convulsed in civil war while the treaty was being worked out. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was dismembered at the end of World War One, and Germany defeated and starving. So nothing now stood in the way of resurrecting a Polish state. Now, in the later stages of the war and the very early stages of the peace, Polish forces had already carved out territory in the west against the Germans in late 1918, early 1919.
So they'd already carved out territory, like Polish forces are changing facts on the ground to force the hands of the diplomats in Paris?
Yes, that's exactly what's happening. And they certainly weren't alone in that. Right across Central and Eastern Europe, various actors are using military force to try and create facts on the ground in advance of decisions being made in Paris, so that the diplomats there won't have much choice, or to give themselves a stronger negotiating hand. But Polish forces weren't just concerned with what was going on in the west, they were even more concerned with the east. They wanted to draw Polish frontiers as far to the east as possible. Now, the ostensible operating principle of the Versailles Peace Conference, which redrew the European borders, was, quote, national self-determination, which means the idea that every nation has its own state, and then people have nothing to fight about.
Yeah, this is Woodrow Wilson's idea, and very American, I think, in its origins. You know, it's really easy for a country that's, you know, almost completely surrounded by water and pretty cohesive in its inhabitants to be self-determined, I think. But
Right,
yeah.
right. Well, it would be easy to point out that the three main players at the conference, the Americans, the British and the French, all lived down to the very worst of their stereotypes. Right? Americans with idealism that had so little relationship to facts on the ground, but because the Americans had basically rescued the British and the French in the last stages of World War One, and they had all the money, and so Woodrow Wilson's idea was the ostensible operating principle, and the others had to pay at least lip service to it. The British, well, they were completely unscrupulous. They didn't really much care where these boundaries lay, as long as there was a balance of power in Europe that would allow Britain to maintain its more than a century-long dominance of the oceans of the world. Right? And the French simply wanted to be revenged on the Germans because they had suffered so much in World War One and had also been invaded by Germany in 1870-71. So they wanted to absolutely impose the most punishing conditions on Germany. So, nobody really emerges from this very well. But the main criticism I would make is actually not any of those things. The trouble with national self-determination is that it's completely unrealistic across vast swathes of Europe. There are no frontiers that could have been drawn that would leave even almost all of one nation on one, or ethnicity on one side of a line and the others on another. It was just totally impossible because different populations had lived alongside one another for centuries and centuries. Right? Loads of people complain about the peace settlement and say, oh, the lines were drawn in the wrong places. This is a mistake. No lines could possibly have been drawn that would not have led to a situation where you've got resentful minorities and majorities suspicious of half of their fellow citizens for belonging to another group and looking over the border longingly. Right? Mm-hmm. So this is the problem.
Yeah, and we talked about that a lot, covering the Balkans. It's the same kind of story there, that just how do you just draw a line somewhere and now suddenly your neighbor belongs to a different country than you do.
Right. And we haven't even taken into account here that loads of people didn't necessarily still define themselves in national terms. Right, to look no further than the German Polish fuzzy line, there were loads of people who saw themselves as both, right? Which annoyed the heck out of Polish nationalists after World War One, and annoyed the heck out of the Nazis when they invaded in 1939. What are you going to do? But you could do exactly the same exercise in many other areas with other groups, Italians and Croats in Istria. Well, loads and loads of people would simply have told you they were both.
Right.
Okay, now let's come to the main character in interwar Poland, and it's this man, Józef Piłsudski. Now, there are lots of other extremely influential people in Polish history. Don't run away with the idea that everything was all about him. It wasn't. But we're trying to make this story as simple as possible, so we're just simply going to focus upon him. He was born in Lithuania, which of course was in the Russian Empire, to an impoverished Szlachta family, Szlachta being the Polish nobility. He spoke 6 languages. In the late 1880s, early 1890s, he was sent to Siberia for his political agitation. Later on, he went to live in Austrian Poland, and they let him organise Polish anti-Russian guerrilla groups from 1906, based in Lvov. During World War One, he raised Polish forces to fight with the Habsburg armies against Russia, which they did until 1917, when the Russian Empire collapsed. And at that point, they went rogue and went independent, because what they really wanted was not just freedom of Poland from Russian rule, they wanted an independent Poland. Well, we've got a pretty cool picture of him here with some of his officers in Wołyń or Volhynia in 1916. He's the guy in the white or cream coloured sweater there, smoking away. Now, he had been involved with both Polish nationalist and socialist organisations before the war. But in 1918, he told his former fellow socialists, "Comrades, I took the red streetcar of socialism to the stop called independence, and that's where I got off. You may keep on to the final stop if you wish, but from now on, let's address each other as Mr. I should explain that amongst communists and hardline socialists, Mr., perhaps in the Polish form of Pan and some other languages, it'd be more obvious than in English, is a kind of insult because it means basically lord. Think of Spanish señor. Now, during the period 1919 to 21, Poland, the infant Poland, whose frontiers are not yet defined, was engaged in 3 wars, and it won all 3. The Polish-Ukrainian War, which we'll look at briefly now, the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to 20, which was easily the biggest, and the very small-scale Polish-Lithuanian War of 1920. I want to engage with the first. This lasts from November 1918, so just as World War I has finished, through to the following summer, with the reality of an independent Poland coming and the prospect of an independent Ukraine as a possible byproduct of the Russian Revolution. The war was fought over territory that was disputable between Poland and Ukraine, and that included, well, that mainly was about eastern Galicia, which was 58% Ukrainian, 34% Polish, and 8% Jewish. But Ukrainians were dominant in the countryside, while towns were mostly Polish and Jewish. Now, this is a very, very frequent phenomenon where you've got one ethnicity, and if there are significant numbers of Jews, it will nearly always include the Jews, but others as well, dominating the towns and commercial and trading life, and then being surrounded by peasantry from a different ethnicity. You can see that again in this part of the world, in the Balkans. You look at old photographs and you see the shops, and the names on the front of so many of them are Jewish or German. And that's who ran the place. And the Slavs lived out in the countryside. Certainly in the early 19th century, not by the end. Well, so yeah, you get the same kind of situation in Hungary. And you've got it here. So the largest city, Lviv, it was roughly 60% Polish, 12% Ukrainian, and 28% Jewish. Now, in the fighting in this war, at least 10,000 Poles and 15,000 Ukrainians were killed. But in fact, it's many more who died from brutal treatment, especially in internment camps set up by both sides. And there were frequent atrocities carried out by both sides. To be entirely fair, neither of the infant governments sanctioned these or wanted them. But on the ground, most fighting was done by irregular militias who were hard to control and often really brutal. Okay, so here we've got some Polish troops in Lvov in 1918. So they win this war, and they make sure that Galicia, what had been Austrian Poland, is going to be included in the Polish state between the wars. Then comes the Polish-Soviet War, which was on a much bigger scale and much more dangerous for the newly forming Poland. We've got a great colorised picture here of Polish troops in February 1919. They're determined to maximise the size of their new state. This map shows that the frontiers as they existed the following month in March, that's the area in cream or yellow there, immediately prior to the outbreak of the Polish-Soviet War. Well, the Bolsheviks are pumping out loads of propaganda against Poland. This poster is directed at Ukrainian peasants, fellow Eastern Slavs, right? Ukrainian-bred Polish landlord. So what that's saying really is that they're really appealing to ethnic and nationalistic feelings, because they're saying that it coincides with the class differences. And there is a lot of truth in that. The Ukrainians were the peasants. The Poles didn't simply dominate the towns, they tended to be the landlords and certainly the nobility in the countryside. And so the Bolsheviks are utilising that.
It was easy to reinforce this idea of you're a different, they wouldn't have really said ethnicity, but you're different than I am, and I feel that because you're a rich town person and I'm a peasant, and something along those lines.
And we speak a different language, and we may have a different church, and yeah, all of that, yes. Right. It's very noticeable. It would be, if it weren't so awful in its effects, one would just laugh, because communism, right through its history, constantly fell back onto nationalist arguments, the very thing that it claimed to hate, to try and galvanise support for its positions against whoever it was fighting now. I mean, that even extends to the Second World War itself, which in the Soviet Union was always called, and in Russia is still called, the Great Patriotic War, right? Because people won't necessarily fight for socialism, but they might fight for Holy Mother Russia.
Right. Okay,
so our next poster is another piece of Soviet propaganda. The new Polish state is a pig trained up in France. In other words, simply created by the Versailles Treaty.
This one's implying that Poland is not a real country. Sounds kind of similar to a line that we've heard more recently.
Yes, it does. It sounds exactly like it in respect of Ukraine. Right. Yes. Yeah, it's just a fabrication. And this next poster, again Soviet propaganda, behind the Polish palm, the Polish lord, is the landlord, never forget. Okay, now, by December 1919, Polish forces had advanced considerably to the east. And you can see here that in the east they've just taken in Minsk, which is the capital today of Belarus. And our next picture shows Pilsudski in Minsk in 1919. We've got a picture here of Polish Uhlans. And they carry on from there. So in the first half of 1920, the Polish tide reaches its greatest extent, and Kiev was occupied. Now, at this point, I should mention that they're collaborating with Ukrainians against the Reds. But the victory was short-lived. That's their high tide, and over the course of the next 2 months, they are dramatically pushed back. Look at the change in that next map. they faced catastrophic reverses at the hands of Tukhachevsky's Red Cavalry Army. So by early August, the Bolsheviks are at the gates of Warsaw. You can see there Warsaw on the map, right near the Red-controlled area.
Yeah, and this is the Red Cavalry Army, or the Red Army, is the Bolsheviks in Russia fighting against Poland, what would be Poland and Ukraine.
Everybody.
Well, everybody, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, they're fighting various species of whites. They're fighting foreign interventionist forces, including from Britain and America. They're fighting rival kinds of socialists, anarchists, actually. They're fighting different nationalist groups in various parts of the Soviet Union. And they may well have seen the Poles in the same light as, for example, Georgian nationalists or something like that. Well, this next picture shows another Polish machine gun nest at Milosno, which is halfway between Minsk and Warsaw, and they were about to... That position was not held, I can tell you now. They had to go back a long, long way from there very quickly. Next picture, another machine gun nest, this time with Polish women soldiers.
Oh, wait, women soldiers, hold on. This was an innovation, wasn't it?
Mostly, not absolutely. There was, in the later stages of Tsarist participation in World War One, there was a so-called Death's Head regiment of women soldiers. But this was generally a desperation measure. And actually for the Poles, it probably was too. Because they really thought that they were going to lose their new state as soon as they had gained it. So, yeah, women were certainly extremely active in supporting men at the front, recruiting nurses and this kind of thing, but also to an extent in the fighting as well, yes. Well, here are some Polish propaganda posters. Kill Bolsheviks, which you would expect. Next one, to arms, invoking the cross against atheistic Bolshevism. So Poles had defined themselves as Catholics against those horrible Orthodox to the east, and now they're defining themselves against those horrible atheists to the east. So you've got a shattered chapel or church there with the broken arms of a crucifix. And the next one is similar. Note the Madonna and Christ Child in the shroud. Well, our next picture shows a Polish machine gun nest just north of Warsaw in August 1920. And there, miraculously perhaps, either metaphorically or even, according to some accounts, literally miraculously, the Poles absolutely shattered the advancing Soviets, and Poland was saved at the last moment. This painting, it's quite a famous painting, shows the Virgin Mary lending a hand in winning the Battle of Warsaw in August 1920.
The Virgin Mary coming to the aid of Poland, is this pretty widely believed in, or is this kind of like a hoorah statement?
I think there'll be a whole spectrum of opinions. Some people who really believe it, others who don't, and a load of people in the middle who kind of, yeah, maybe. The thing is, it's part of the Polish national myth that Poland has a special relationship with the Virgin Mary. Right? So it is a religious national myth. I describe religious national myths in my book Gods of War, for anybody who wants to look that up online or on Amazon or something like that, Gods of War, and there's a couple of chapters given over to three of the strongest examples of this, the now mercifully defunct British one, but the Russian and Serbian ones, which are still very much with us. But then there's a second rank of religious national myths that are strong but not quite as strong as those three. And in that second rank, you know, snapping at their heels, would be the US, a land given by Providence, and Poland. Right? It's not as extreme as the others, but it's still a little worrying.
A little extra free advertising for you there.
A little extra free. There will always be free advertising in this show. Yeah.
Right.
brazen self-promotion. What can you do? Okay, so we've already plugged several books and we'll plug one more in a couple of minutes. But here is a movie, The Battle of Warsaw, 1920. It's inevitably romanticised and patriotic, but it's nevertheless a movie well worth watching to get something of the flavour of the period.
I thought you hated historical movies.
Yeah, I do. Not necessarily on principle, just in practice, 90 to 95% of the time. Occasionally I come across one that gets it about right. But what my experience in teaching was that when students' eyes lit up because they suddenly connected with something you were discussing in class with a movie they'd seen, I found that I had more work to do, not less, because they'd come out of the movie knowing less than if they'd never seen it. Because it's so full of romanticism in some cause or another, or patriotism that kind of is just a grotesque distortion, or projects postmodern values back onto the Middle Ages, and think of the Kingdom of Heaven or something like that. You know, all of these kinds of things. So mostly they're just frightful. And I'm not pretending that the Battle of Warsaw 1920 is exactly immune from all of this. Right? It's clearly there, and it's clearly got an agenda. And you know the Bolsheviks are demons and so on, which in their leadership they probably were actually. That's fair enough. it's still worth watching, partly for the entertainment value, and you know there's a bit of romance thrown in, of course, but at least it gives you something of the flavour of the period and of the dynamics of what's going on, even if you want to take the romanticisation and so on with several pinches of salt. Okay, so there's this miraculous rescue in the Battle of Warsaw, and the Soviet forces are thrown back. Our next picture shows the Red Cavalry Army under Tukhachevsky, the most feared unit of the Red Army, brilliantly successful in the Russian Civil War. First has the same kind of effect against the Poles, but then thrown back outside Warsaw, and a few days later it's heavily defeated at the Battle of Komarów, far to the east, and its morale never really recovered after that. So our next picture shows us the Polish-Soviet border established by the Treaty of Riga in 1921. And that settles Poland's borders for the interwar period. Now, in that Polish-Soviet war, at least 60,000 Poles and 48,000 Soviets had been killed in the fighting.
So we finally got the shape of interwar Poland here.
Right. And now we've left a number of things out of our story, particularly what's going on in the West, the fact that the port of Danzig is like a so-called free city or city-state sandwiched between East Prussia, the rest of Germany, and the so-called Polish corridor to the sea. We haven't entered into that because we haven't got time, and in any case we're focusing really on the Polish-Ukrainian kind of interactions. But we simply have to look at the status of Vilnius here, and that brings us to the third of these wars, which is way smaller than the other two. So just as the Polish-Soviet War is winding down, there's a Polish-Lithuanian war, in theory from 1919 to 20, but nearly everything that happens in late 1920. It's fought essentially about the city of Vilnius, or Vilno, in Polish, Vilna in Russian, which the new state of Lithuania wanted as its capital. Today, Vilnius is the capital of Lithuania, but which linguistically was overwhelmingly Polish and Jewish. Only 6% of the inhabitants were Lithuanian. So it's like the same kind of situation as you've got in Lviv, right? Like Poland, Lithuania had been fighting the Bolshevik Red Army. They even cooperated with the Poles a bit. And after the Soviets were defeated at Warsaw, the Soviet government mischievously made peace with Lithuania and ceded it Vilnius, knowing that the Lithuanians would be glad to have it and the Poles would be furious and would fight them. So they did this in order to slow the advance of Polish forces, and the strategy worked. The fighting between Poland and Lithuania was mostly during September and October. There were 200 to 300 deaths on each side. It's, again, more complicated than we're telling you here. it's not quite true to say simply that Poland gets this territory, but in the end it does. And so between the world wars, Vilnius then remains part of Poland. Well, this picture shows Lithuanian soldiers in Vilnius Cathedral Square, and they wouldn't be there for very long, they'd soon be ejected. And anybody who wanted to pursue this, I'd recommend this book, which is really excellent, Vilnius Between Nations. It takes a much longer view of the history of Vilnius than we're considering here, but this episode comes right in the middle of it, and that is one really good book on the interactions between the various ethnicities and Vilnius under Russian rule and so on. So yeah.
What was it about Vilnius that made both sides really want it? I mean, why was it so desirable?
Well, because it's a major city and a commercial centre, and it's surrounded by a Lithuanian-speaking population, right? But in the city itself, it's a different ethnicity. So Poles can say, well, this is a historically Polish city, all right? Complicated by the fact that for a long time before Poland was partitioned in the late 18th century, Poland and Lithuania had been part of one vast commonwealth together. So none of this had mattered, right? Then they're all subject to the Russians. It doesn't matter again. But once we've got nation states, then suddenly we're one another's enemies and rivals for the same goods. Right? So yeah, it really didn't matter. At that stage, Poland was obviously stronger and got it. The situation would change for reasons we will have reason to notice in later episodes. So, we've been looking today overwhelmingly at the Polish side of the story. Next week we're going to look at partly the same period, at least the tail end of World War I and its aftermath, on the Ukrainian side of things, and then look at Ukrainian experience under the Soviet Union, particularly the Holodomor, the man-made famine generated by the communists in the 1930s, and the arguments about that go on to today. And we will take it up to the time of the Soviet occupation of Western Ukraine, Eastern Poland, after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the deal that Stalin did with the Nazis in 1939.
Well, I don't think I've heard you talk that fast since I've had a lecture with you years ago that was unfortunately scheduled right before lunch hour.
You're just too good to me. But you are right. Oh dear. Yeah, well, we had a lot of material to get through there. And a word to our viewers, we did actually axe some of the material from this because we realised we were going to overshoot and then gallop like mad with what we still have in here. So, we hope you've enjoyed this. Please do repost this episode if you like it and subscribe.
Thanks everybody for hanging in here with us, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, goodbye everybody. Bye bye now.